join me in giving an amazing welcome to you.
You're amazing, Sally. Hi, friends. Okay, so I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about CSS in this hardware chatbot block of the conference. Also, shout out to my Photoshop skills. Look how well this worked. Okay, so I will be reading you a tale. But first, a couple of disclaimers. There is no caroling involved in this presentation. Sally mentioned that I do play ukulele and sing for a podcast that I do every other week. It's called Tools Day. If you want to hear me singing, listen to that. I apologize, no caroling. Maybe next time. Also, yes, I know it's springtime, but this has been my past 4 weeks. It has snowed almost every single week in the Northeast in America, and that's why my flight was canceled. I got a new one, but I'm here now. I'm super excited to be here. Also, I know this is themed around a Christmas carol, but it is not about religion. I'm really not religious, and even if I was religious, I'm definitely not Christian. This is my ancestry report. How insane is that? There's like no genetic diversity in my, anyway. I thought this was crazy, but let's get started. So I'm here to talk to you to use this story to sort of frame our conversation about CSS. And this story was written by Charles Dickens in 1844 and stood the test of time. There are still plays about this. There are still people who are reading this book to their children. There's movies about this that come out frequently. There's been at least 4 or 5 that I saw while doing my research for this talk. And it's a tale about a Scrooge who has this ghost kind of come to him and say, "You need help. Let's examine your past, your present, and your future." And that's a great way to sort of help us determine how we can see ourselves and see the right code we write and how we can write code in the future by examining the past, the present, and the future. Also, fun fact, Scrooge entered the Oxford English Dictionary in the 80s as a real word. So, you know, there's a lot of CSS Scrooges out there right now, I think. Very timely conversation to have. So let's talk about the ghosts of CSS Past. And this is going to take us into a journey back in time. Close your eyes. Just kidding, open them, because I need to show you the slide. Back to a time when Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry were the best technical educators in the field. Back to a time when these were modern web browser icons. The world, I don't even know what that is. Back to a time when we were doing image mapping for links in Dreamweaver, and then rewind 3 years before that. This is when we were doing a lot of crazy CSS hacks. We still do CSS hacks, but people were doing like browser targeting to target specific browsers. To do this, they had to also know which browsers supported certain features and which ones didn't. So you could do things like the bracket hack if you wanted a certain feature to be shown in Chrome and not other browsers, in Opera back then. If you wanted to support IE 5, 6, and 7, but not other browsers, you could have this asterisk, and it would be blue in IE 5, 6, and 7 for some reason, and then green everywhere else, right down here. So there is actually entire websites dedicated to showing you like all of these different hacks. You could see there's many. And then Paul Irish also did a website that kind of demonstrates if something matches in your browser or doesn't match in your browser. You could see that there are a lot of things that do work in this browser. But we don't have to do that anymore because we have @supports. And @supports allows us to target individual properties. So here, if you want to use grid, you could do @supports grid and then apply your styling. Now, with @supports, something to remember is it's not supported in IE. It's supported everywhere else. But you still need to have a backup. You still have to send some kind of code for your IE users. And then you can send @supports to not have that code be overridden in IE, just be ignored. So keep this in mind when you're supporting your users, when you're building your websites. There's also the null transform hack. And this looked like this. So you could either do translate Z of 0 or translate 3D of 0, 0, 0. And this would create sort of a fake layer on our image. It wouldn't cause any visual change, but it would composite our layers together for smooth animations. So you can get that 60 frames per second. And so this is great because it composited our layers. It used GPU acceleration instead of CPU, so that's why we got that nice smooth visual. There were smoother animations because of it, and the layers got their own backing surface, which is cool. But it also uses more memory, and sometimes it appeared more pixelated for users. So there are pros and cons. But we don't have to do that anymore either because we have will change. And will change is a property that you can apply to your CSS that you specify what animations are going to change, letting your browser know that those animations are going to change ahead of time. So you don't have to use this hack, but you get all the benefits from it and also all the negatives from it. So if you're using animations and you're using will change, be sure not to overdo it for your user because it'll drain their battery, et cetera, et cetera. So we can use this now. The will change property is a progressive enhancement, so even though Edge and IE don't support it, you could probably still use it for your users. The users that have support for will change will just see a smoother animation. So this is pretty okay to use. Want to talk about the clear fix? Woo! Beware of float. It's almost like Ghost. Whatever. I have cute ghosts in here because I looked up Ghost on Google and it was terrifying, so I got the cute ones. So clearfix kind of looked like this back in the day. You could have your breaking divs that had style clear both. You had parents that you had to do overflow hidden. I know that I definitely did this a lot for my rows. But we've grown up a lot since then, haven't we? We have Flexbox, we have Grid, and that brings me to the ghosts of CSS Present. Speaking of Grid, let's talk about Grid. Grid is really cool. So the next few examples are from Jules Forrest, who does these really cool CSS Grid experiments, where she takes inspiration from real life, and she takes a screenshot or not a fax, what are they called when you put it in the machine? Copier. She copies them into your computer and also creates them in CSS. The one on the left is copied in. The one on the right is just pure code created with Grid. Here's another cool example from a magazine inspiration. And here's a menu. So not only do we get all of this natively in the browser, but you get all the SEO benefits. You don't have to create images for these things. Grid allows us to create any layout we want. Grid allows us to lay things out horizontally as well as vertically. I personally like using Grid with emoji, because you can see your entire layout that way. So Grid template, you can see, is super, super powerful. Right here, you get a visual representation of this entire layout. And I could adjust sizes here. I could even adjust the layout. So if I wanted my sidebar to be longer, I could just, in the browser, directly change it, alter how this looks. There's a grid gap. There's so many great features of Grid. Guys, use Grid if you haven't yet. Support is up. Pretty good. We'll get to that in a minute, too. Grid has a few great features like repeat, auto sizing, and fractional units that allow you to create a lot of interesting layouts. An example of this is one of them. So you can do little tricks with Grid. Like I could write in here, and it gives me this horizontal bar with a title in the middle, but that horizontal bar will always stay even with that title. And we're using a few different Grid properties for that. We're using auto and fractional unit. So here you can see kind of what's going on here. You have your Grid template column set to 1FR, auto, and 1FR. So I can type in here, and I can type in here, but it's not going to change because it's taking up one fractional unit of the remaining space of that horizontal grid. But with the auto, it's just taking up the space that I'm allotting it and putting within this text center. So in the previous page, what you could see here is the exact same example where you have that auto flow, and you have the 1FR on each side as a before and after pseudo element. So you can create these sort of dividers and start to get really creative. And Grid came out March of last year, so exactly 1 year. It started getting browser support really, really quickly. We're seeing it everywhere now. So these things, these discoveries are just getting started. If you want to start playing with Grid, now's the time. As I briefly mentioned earlier, support is pretty good. It's partial support in IE because it actually uses a slightly different syntax than what is supported now in most major browsers. And that's because IE actually implemented Grid before the other browsers did, but it was a different syntax. So it doesn't really work in IE. It works in the other browsers that you see here. So you might want to send a Flexbox fallback if you can, or just align things as needed if you are supporting IE users. So the next thing I want to talk about are CSS custom properties, or CSS variables. This is another really cool tool that CSS got recently. And this allows us to have real variables, real dynamic variables that live in your CSS that you can update through JavaScript. You can update right here, so I can just update it, and it propagates throughout the entire document structure. So anywhere I have this variable, it will update. And that's different than what we used to have to do, which is through preprocessors, because those preprocessors just ended up generating a color value, and you couldn't dynamically update them like I'm doing on the screen now. The other thing you can do is update these using JavaScript. So if I open my console and I type in document.documentElement.style.setProperty, because these are set on the root, I can update any value. So here I'm going to update color primary, and I'm going to set that to green because I'm really creative. And there it just automatically changes. So you can use JavaScript to update this. You can use mouse flow. You can use any property that you can write in JavaScript to update CSS properties as variables inside of your CSS code. And it doesn't have to be colors, numbers work, any value works. I can put gradients in here. It's really, really powerful, this CSS variable tool that we have available to us today. Support for that also is pretty good. It's supported in the latest Edge. It's been supported in Firefox, Chrome, Safari for a while. Again, IE doesn't have support for this, but that's a theme that we see sometimes when people give talks. Let's talk about CSS filters. I love CSS filters. You can apply filters to images. They're interoperable, so you can animate them. Like if I take away this filter, it'll blur back. You can adjust the brightness of things. You can make them darker. If I set the brightness to 0, our ghost is gone. Another great trick is that you can actually adjust the colors of pretty much anything that's not pure black. So even though I have this ghost, I can make that ghost green or pink or blue by using hue rotate. Now you might be thinking, okay, I don't see anything here, it's not changing. Well, we gotta do some things first. So you see the filter list that we have here. I can pick out sepia. I'll pick sepia, and I'll apply sepia to this ghost. And there, it's like a slight yellow. So we're still not really getting color from it. But then what we can do is just chain these filters, because with filters, you can just list on and on and on. Let's make it really saturated. So now it's yellow. And now we can adjust this hue rotation, make it like negative 130 degrees. Did I do something? OK, well, this usually changes if I update this. Let's add the hue rotate at the end. So there we go. We're seeing our ghost updating its color value, and we can get it to be any color we want because filters are magical and filters work really well together. You don't only have to use filters on images, however. We can recreate a little thing that I used to use all the time, which was Sass color functions. So Sass used to provide us with lighten and darken and saturate and hue rotate, all those things that people would create entire palettes out of and people would use for hover states on links. And they would use them a lot throughout the application. With filters, we can also use them in the same ways. We can use them on text. So here I'm using filters to recreate those same properties that we had as Sass functions, or any preprocessor functions. PostCSS has this, Stylus has this. I'm not beholden to one, just an example. But we can lighten and darken, adjust hue, saturate. Anything you can do with images, you can also do with text. You can do it with video, you can do it with iframes. You can apply filters and blend modes to any of these. And browser support is pretty good for this. That's why it's in the current section of this talk. It just has partial support in Edge, which means that not all of the filters are supported. But if you're trying to do brightness, that's definitely supported. Contrast. IE, again, doesn't work. No comment. So the next thing I want to talk about is display contents, which just came to my attention. Really, really interesting property here. So essentially, what this allows us to do is we don't have to hack inherited parent styles, which kind of happen all the time. And you can also have these pass-through parent styles, because display contents allows us to say that whatever element this is, I want to see the elements inside of it without applying any of the display properties from the parent. A visual is probably a better way to explain this. So say we have this example where we have this grid of items, and they're all with display flex, that parent that contains them all. This entire div is display flex. We have each of these items, and then we have this multi-item div within that. Now, with Flexbox and with Grid, these properties don't get passed down to their children. They stop, and you have to say display flex again or display grid again. If you're using display contents, however, we can get rid of all of the styling from the parent, and it'll take the styling from that parent's parent. So we can see something like this, where it got rid of that border, and it got rid of that display block, and it flexed with the rest of this grid, or flexed with the rest of the flex box in this case. Another example I can show you is here. So we have this unordered list, which has a block view. It's an inline block display. But if we say display contents, that means that all the items within it are just going to grow to the parent div, which is this entire div. If I do display contents inside of the li, you'll see that all that is left is the actual content. It is just the text within that list item. It doesn't get any of that styling that is the layout of it. So this is really interesting to me. Just came out for Chrome 65 that came out earlier this month. And it's still not supported in all browsers, but it is something that we should look out for, because it's a really interesting property that lets us work a lot easier with grid and flex. When you have these issues where you need subgrids, it's starting to help with that. So that leads us to the ghosts of CSS Future. I'm really excited about this section. I've been playing with this for a while. Let's start with variable fonts. Have you all seen variable fonts? Okay, a couple of hands. If you haven't seen, prepare to be mind blown. Variable fonts are great because they allow us to send a single font file to our users, and with that single font file, we can edit multiple properties, and those properties are really dependent on the font. So here we can edit the width and the weight of this font value. There are other examples where variable fonts have these properties where they can stretch and fit into different boxes. In this example, you'll see some of that. So I'm typing out here, and this will stretch or shrink. You can see how it fits in that box. Some of the variable fonts have different parameters, such as the serif that you can open and close, have different decorative details on them. But all we're doing is sending a single font to our user, which means that we don't have to overwhelm them with these massive font files. I also found this example on Axis Praxis, and this is an example of an animation of a running horse. And this was really interesting to me because they're making this animation out of text. They're using this font called Muybridge, and there's this animation called Gallop. And what that animation is doing is it's using font variation settings of time and going from 0 to 1,000. So there's 1,000 characters here that they're animating over. If I set it to 500, you could see it breaks that animation chain, and the horse sort of stops its gallop midway. But here, again, if it's 1,500, then it's doing a full rotation and stops. So there's a ton that we can do with variable fonts. The support is definitely work in progress, but it's an exciting opportunity out there. There's two really, really good resources if you want to see more. Axis Praxis does a lot of interesting work with variable fonts, and there's also v-fonts.com, which has the largest number of variable fonts I've seen just listed in a row with all of their variations and alternates. So definitely check out those resources. I'd love to put them up here now, but just know about them. Explore on your own. So the next property I want to talk about is text decoration. With text decoration, we're starting to be able to have a lot more control over what our content looks like. So text decoration is typically what we know that we apply to link styles to give them underlines, and that's exactly what you see here, just text with an underline. But we can start to play, text decoration color is something that we can change. So that line under there doesn't have to be a border, it can just be a part of the text. We can change the style of this. We can make it dashed, or we can make it dotted. We can make it my favorite, which is wavy. We can make it double. And you can also change the position of it. So it doesn't have to be underline. It could be overline, or it could be line through, which is kind of like what we see with the strike through. But then you're allowed to retain that text decoration style when you do set it to line through. I'll just set it back to underline, because the next property is something that we've seen talked about for a while. I'll just set this back to solid. So this is text decoration skip ink. And what people used to do here is outline their text and use a border to underline their text with. But now we can just set it to auto, and it'll skip all those descenders. And this is something that we can introduce right now in our work, because it works in Chrome, it works in Firefox. The support for this is growing. And it is a progressive enhancement as well. If you don't have text decoration skip ink skipping your descenders in IE, that's OK. So looking at it, support for those properties currently works in Firefox, Chrome, Safari, not yet in Edge and IE, but again, it is progressive enhancement, so it's pretty safe to use. Next thing I want to talk about is image set. Image set is really, really cool because it allows us to have image optimization, image performance in background images in our CSS. So what we have seen now is a way to update our images. Whoa, why is it saying non-retina? Oh, I wonder if that's for the display. Anyway, what this allows for you to do is apply two different images based on the dimension of your screen. So what you normally had before this was a picture element where you can apply a source set of items inside of a HTML element in your DOM, and you can inject different images based on the retina display or other properties, such as the width of your document. Now, image set allows us to do this within our CSS as a background. So that wasn't something we could do before. And you can test this inside of your Chrome inspector. So you have these little tabs here. One says laptop with high DPI screen. So that's usually what shows up on my screen, but I think the projector was showing as non-retina. And then there's also this laptop with medium DPI screen. So you can test DPI inside of your Chrome inspector, and it's great for this property. So now we can apply different images that we're sending to our user for better image performance. You're not sending these massive, high-res images if they don't have a retina screen as background images. So that is image set, and it's an exciting opportunity for image performance. So I guess this screen is non-retina. That makes sense. Excellent. So support for that looks like this. Here we have Chrome supported, we have Safari supported, which is cool because you can send smaller images on those two devices, Safari specifically for mobile. Hopefully we'll see more support around this. It's something that I think is super, super useful, and I really, really hope to see more in the future. So now I want to talk about the even further future, and to get into that, I want to talk about what these terms mean. So when I'm talking about the further future, I'm probably talking about the editor's draft or working draft of the W3C. The editor's draft is essentially like a working document. Don't be fooled by these names. And then the working draft is still a working document, but it's like a fixed point for that working document. So the W3C publishes that fixed point for community review, whereas the editor's draft, it could be any individual editor or group of editors making changes to that fixed point. So at any given time, there are usually both editor's drafts and working drafts in view for any individual person, for any individual W3C property or item or element they're working on. There's also candidate recommendations, proposed recommendations, and then finally W3C recommendations, which is what makes web standards. So ambient light queries are pretty cool. What I mean by ambient light queries is the ability to detect the light that surrounds your user as they're using your app or your website. And ideally, this is what they're going to look like. I'll zoom in here. So ideally, there's going to be these queries that are like app media, light level dim, where you can make the background dark and the text light. So if they're in a dark space, you can adjust their experience and make their reading experience easier. There's this light level wash that's in the spec, where if it's super, super bright, if it's a sunny day, which I haven't seen in weeks now, you can make the text bigger and bolder and darker on a light background. So these are the things that theoretically are coming in the CSS future. But for now, you can kind of do this in JavaScript, some browsers, like one browser. And you can add an event listener for device light, where you can check for dim and bright, and then apply CSS styles for that. So I can do a little demo here. I'll open up Firefox, because that browser it works on. I've got it pulled up here. So I'll make this big. I never use Firefox, unfortunately, so I don't really know the commands. So here you can see the same demo that we saw earlier. It's detecting dim light on the stage. But if I take my phone and my flashlight and I flash it at this, it appears much brighter and darker than it was a second ago. So it's applying those styles that I applied in my CSS using JavaScript in that instance to set them. So I do have a hardware demo. Haha. So ambient light queries we may see in the future. The browser support looks like this. Edge actually has the best support for this. Firefox has that partial support, and there's no support elsewhere. There is support under a flag in Chrome. This might change because of security. So it's questionable, but it is very cool that, for example, publishers, like a place that I work, can start to think about the user experience in terms of where they're from. And responsive design can mean more than just screen size. It can mean where you are geographically, where you are in the daytime, where you are in a room. So that's pretty cool. So the current status for that is deferred to the next draft because of the privacy issues that they are working out. But things that we can do currently in media queries level 4 are orientation. So you can set media queries for portrait or landscape device orientation. You can set minimum resolutions for your print media queries. You can set color, like monochrome. You can use not all monochrome. Like, these are things that we can leverage more of. You can set styles for projections, so you can make things brighter on projections. I can make my presentation look entirely differently on that screen than it does on my screen, which is a terrible idea, but it's a possibility. Okay, let's talk about conic gradients. This is a conic gradient. Essentially, what that means is a gradient that starts in the center and goes in a circle with a single line. And Leah Veru has done a lot of great work with conic gradients. She's created this polyfill for conic gradients, and does a lot of talks that show their use cases, like pie charts and checkerboard styles. There's a lot that you can do here. So browser support is pretty bad. But this leads me into my next topic, and that is, it's a working draft. It's behind a flag, right? Okay. But we can make this happen with Houdini. Okay, I guess y'all, who's heard of Houdini? Okay, so why aren't you more excited? Okay, so with Houdini, what we get is the ability to edit the browser's CSS object model. So we get access to this little core bubble, this blue dotted line that nothing else gets access to. You can use JavaScript to alter the DOM. We all know that. You can write polyfills to do that. It'll go through Cascade, Layout, Paint, Composite. But you cannot currently access the CSS object model. And what Houdini does is it allows us to write CSS worklets to gain access to the browser's internal CSS object model. It's really cool. So that means you have improved performance because you don't have to go through that entire layout engine again. You're just putting in your invention into the CSS itself. You can normalize cross-browser differences. So if the browsers all support Houdini, then we don't have to worry about if one browser is ahead of another if we want to implement a property. Because we can just build new features, we can invent these new features without having to wait on browsers because we are writing the CSS ourselves, the CSS object model. So the way that that works is through these different worklets, and there's a few different ones out there. There's the Layout API, the Paint API, the Parser API, Properties and Values, Animation Worklet, Typed Object Model, and Font Metrics. So these are in different states of readiness. The Paint API is currently ready in Chrome 65. That came out 2 weeks ago, which is exciting. And you can see that that is also being worked on in Firefox. There's different examples of animation worklet things inside the Houdini group that I've seen that are interesting. But we're going to play with the Paint API because we can actually demonstrate it on stage today in the latest version of Chrome. This is an example by Will Boyd from his blog, which I highly recommend you go read. Like, that link is a really, really good resource. And he created this. Now, it doesn't look like much until I explain what it is. He created a worklet, a little Paint worklet here, where he set this style that creates those boxes with the line through that we kind of see as sort of for placement only images. So what he's doing here is he is registering this paint called placeholder box using Canvas to determine what is going to be drawn there. So drawing from top left to bottom right, top right to bottom left, creating that visual based on the div that it's within, and then exporting it. And then within the HTML, you have to do this thing where you import it as a paint worklet module, because it doesn't work like normal JavaScript. You don't get access to all the same things. It's a little bit different. So you have to import it as a worklet, and then you can use it in your CSS. So then you could set the background image here to the paint of the placeholder box. So you've now invented this property that you have access to inside of CSS that you can apply to anything that's a placeholder inside of your DOM. So inside his DOM, he just uses these different boxes as placeholders, which is pretty cool. So I also played with this API. I don't really know Canvas that well, but I'm definitely going to learn it more now. And just essentially played with color based on the size of that div, iterated through, made some rainbows in my text, created these grids of rectangles, registered that worklet, and then just used it to decorate as a background. Paint rainbow ties. It's just the future, my friends. Also, you can register individual properties. You can create your own individual properties. So here's an example of that. In the previous version of Chrome and in other browsers, you can't, well, in any browser, in Chrome right now, you can't animate gradients. You just can't do it. They're not interoperable. But with the Paint worklet, with the Paint API, you can create properties that are based on color. So if you look at the worklet file here, this JavaScript, this is actually just using the Paint API. You can register a property called colorstop1, and you can register a property called colorstop2, and base those off of color, and then it will be animatable. Because we're using those property values that we created, colorstop1, colorstop2, we registered them, and now we have access to them as colors, not as a gradient. So that's pretty cool. Will Boyd is just even cooler than I'll ever imagine to be in my life. So he created this whole beautiful invention, has the same exact workflow here with the JavaScript and the HTML. And then IMVDO made this website where he explores additional things you can do, such as the conic gradient. You can do this with Houdini. You can create your own CSS properties because you have access to the CSS object model. And like he's done this corners gradient. There's slanted backgrounds, checkboxes that are styled, but they're applied as just paint checkbox. Huh. Magic. There's these different background properties you get access to. You can rotate it. One that I really like is the corner shapes. This is a great example of using the Houdini CSS Paint API. You can change the shape of this here. I would encourage you to go play with this because there's a lot of really great examples here. Ooh, that I haven't even discovered all the uses of Houdini. There's so many out there. There was a great example that was put out by Google where they have the material UI where you click and it ripples through. That was a Houdini Paint API use case. So lots of really cool stuff out there. I hope I've shown you the magic and showered you with the glitter of Houdini because it's really cool. So there's a lot of other great future CSS things that are coming out there. You can go to drafts.cssworkinggroup.org if you want to kind of follow along yourself. I'm kind of a nerd for this stuff, so I like to kind of see what's coming up in the pipeline. But rhythmic sizing is interesting because they're working on rhythmic sizing where it's more evenly spaced based on a baseline. So you can have like, remember when you would have like a piece of lined paper and that was all the paper you had in your house? You had no more like printer paper and you had to print a report for school and it was all like not even with the actual lined paper? Just me? Okay. So what they're working on in CSS is allowing for baselining to really be set by the designer or the developer for that, like vertical spacing. Fill and stroke is getting an update. You can apply multiple colors for your stroke levels. Fill, they're kind of trying to work with how you define fills, like with Illustrator, how you can paint on the outside of a line, the inside of a line, what you exclude, what you don't exclude. Color level 4 has different types of color, like lab color. There's selectors level 4. I don't remember what's new about selectors, but it was good. So go explore yourselves. But there's a lot of exciting things out there with the future of CSS. The future of CSS is merry and bright. And I hope this journey through the past, the present, and the future of what is out there has helped you understand and discover yourself as a developer and a designer. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that. I was like...